big areas now that you put your drink, you put a bucket if you want. First trees and islands. Water.
Hi everyone. Shalom. Welcome to 2020. So tonight I wanted to teach about the Aleinu prayer. And in your pack there, you can see the first part of it here on page 586 on Mishkan Tefillah. There is more parts to the Aleinu, obviously. It goes on for pages. But this part of the Aleinu is what I wanted to focus on tonight. So specifically, some of the more controversial, I'd say not necessarily controversial, but things that have been adapted and spoken about throughout the prayer's history, and why eventually we came to have the top version and the bottom version, and why we do the top version here at Temple Israel, and we have for the last almost 3 years. I want to give a prerequisite that some of the translation that we see in Mishkan Tefillah is a little bit more, certainly more pluralistic, egalitarian, a little more poetic. So I wanted to start with some of these first moments of where the Aleinu prayer gets its origin. So when we say, let us now praise, Aleinu l'shabeach, another way to say that is, we must praise. Which goes until this first paragraph here, Ein Od, right, at the top. There is none else. All of that is what we call post-biblical. I guess, come on over and grab one of these. Post-biblical, meaning that it comes from sources that are not from the Tanakh. But it is modeled after biblical prayer and filled with biblical motifs, parallelism. So you see, if you read the Aleinu, let us now praise the Sovereign of the universe and proclaim the greatness of the Creator, right? Those are parallels. Who spread out the heavens and established the earth. Those are parallels. Whose glory is revealed in the heavens above and whose greatness is manifest throughout the world. That's a pretty standard biblical poetic idea that you have two stitches that reinforce one another. So you see this a great deal in the Psalms and that sort of thing. So it models biblical poetry in that way. Now, the main, as I said, controversial, maybe not controversial, arguing point is this next line, right? And we get this from the bottom version, which we do not do anymore. Let us now praise the Sovereign of the universe and proclaim the greatness of the Creator, who has set us apart from the other families of the earth. That's the line, right? That's the one we're going to be talking about today, okay?
Was that in the old Tanakh, the old prayer book?
So we'll get to that.
Okay.
Who did not make us? This is in biblical terms, the sense, well, this is one interpretation. The sense was supposed to be not Jewish superiority. When we say it's not supposed to be, because we don't really know exactly, but there is an idea of particularism or universalism. But instead, the Jews' gratitude for being shown how to worship the one proper God. This is just an interpretation, by the way. This is not the right answer necessarily. Some interpreters would say this was the original idea behind the line that was censored out of the prayer. Now, for those who believe, and I agree with them, that the words, who set us apart from the other families of the earth, can be problematic. What you don't know is that it was worse before, and we'll talk about that in the history. There was a line that says, for they bow down low to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who does not save. So it was a lot worse before, okay? But we'll talk about that in a moment. There's a line as the King of Kings, we would now say like the rulers or whatever. is, the idea that the Holy One, blessed be God, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, that's a rabbinic idea. We see that a lot. It is typically in the Talmud translated as the Holy Blessed One, blessed be He, but now that we are Reformed and more sort of understanding of gender neutral, we say the Holy One, blessed be God. But it's just this idea that God is even higher than all the kings or rulers to be more gender fluid. If you go into the post-biblical aspects, like the Talmud, 5th century rabbinic texts, where a great deal of this comes from. Those first words, Aleinu l'shabeach l'adon hakol, we must praise the master of all. A 14th century commentator records a tradition according to which the biblical Joshua instituted the recitation of the Aleinu after conquering Jericho. Now, it's just a tradition. It's a nice idea. We don't know that happened. But it's very cool how they decided that. The claim is supported by finding the word Hoshea, a variant version of Joshua's name, encoded in the prayer. The last letter Hoshea, Ayin, comes from the first letter of Aleinu. The second to last letter of Hoshea, Shin, comes from the first letter of the thought following that, Shalosam, who did not make. The Vav, not the Van, the Vav, the second letter of Hoshea is the first letter of Nachnu Korim, which Nachnu will be, and finally the Hey, in which Hoshea begins from Hu Elohim. So it's this idea that you sort of find hidden in it the name of Joshua. So it's a cool little legend for you, but I wouldn't put too much into it. According to Rabbi Joel Sirks, who lived in 17th century Poland, the Aleinu is the theological summary at the end of the service, reminding us of God's unity and the ultimate goals of eradicating idolatry. We now say it at the end of every service, but some medieval authorities regulated it to the evening service alone. It's very future-oriented. If you go to things that we say, right, on that day, God's name shall be one, and will be one. That's very apocalyptic sort of thing, that end of days sort of prayer, where we anticipate the next day and think about God's ultimate triumph over idolatry. Now, again, these are the ideas that it triumphs over idolatry. It has become much more complicated, which we will talk about in a moment. Now, the history. This is really where we get into it, okay? And I apologize in advance if my autocorrect continued to correct Aleinu into alien. So it happens all the time. It's really obnoxious, I don't know, but it just keeps doing it. So anyway, that line, that wonderful line, who did not make us like the families of the earth. As we said earlier, until the Middle Ages, it was worse. It added, for they, we don't know who they was, for they bow down low to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who does not save. Now, in terms of when this was created, which was probably post-biblical sort of rabbinic, so in those early first couple centuries, it probably was a polemic against paganism, right? Before Christianity and Islam even existed, right? That worshipped idols, right? The Egyptians and the Babylonians and all those people who bowed down to nothing, basically. But in the medieval times, it was, and I can't particularly blame them, interpreted to denote Christianity and Islam. Bow down low to vanity and emptiness and pray to a God who does not save. Does sort of sound like a polemic against those other religions. To be fair, during this time, Jews lived under Christian rule and Muslim rule, and so their services were sometimes monitored, and sometimes there was some oppression or discrimination that occurred, and so they had to be very conscious about what they said, because if it was understood by those who were the ruling party, if it was anti-Christian or anti-Muslim, well, there are pogroms or horrible consequences that would happen, okay? So there's a little bit in here about how, the Jews at this point in medieval times had experienced the Crusades in 1096. And on the way to Jerusalem, to liberate Jerusalem, the Christians went through the Rhineland and decimated every Jewish village that they could find. A great deal of our liturgy was changed in that time, especially the Kaddish, which we talked about, because so many people were orphaned. And so they went on to Israel. By 1198, of course, that had been taken over by Islam, and the war between Muslims and Christians sure seemed like the end of times were near, and so it made sense that these apocalyptic prayers, like the Aleinu, that one day this will all end, sort of happened. But in that context as well, changes were made to make sure that this prayer was not offensive, and so that line was removed. I want to make sure that we acknowledge that the line was removed, because there's a great deal of what we would say criticism from some of our cultural orthodox or liturgists who believe that we have changed the Aleinu, which we have, and it was like the first time that this has happened. That's not how things go. Liturgy is changed for multiple reasons and multiple times, and so Reform Judaism continues that tradition by taking a look at the world around us and seeing if the liturgy is appropriate or not. So if anyone says, hey, you guys changed the Aleinu, you can say, you guys did first. So, in the historical context, Aleinu was mined for hidden meaning. Abraham ben Ariel of Bohemia wrote in 1234, I've heard that we should say to vanity and emptiness, remember that line that was removed, because the gematria, the numerical sort of hidden meaning of everything, of every Hebrew letter has a numerical number, and everything has all these hidden meanings. The words are equivalent to Jesus and Muhammad. In other words, in Hebrew, the letters that make up vanity and emptiness add up to the same letters that would make Jesus and Muhammad. Sort of a problematic coincidence. So he says, anyone who believes in these two pray to vanity and emptiness. Such interpretations were known to Christians, and in the 14th century, an apostate known as Pesach Peter charged the Jews with revealing Christianity in their own worship. This was a problem not just in the beginning of Christianity, but in medieval times as well, that those who would cross over from Judaism to Christianity would then go back and look at some of the texts and say, hey, this is actually really good for Christians, or hey, this is really insulting to Christians. And so they would sort of take our prayers out of context and do so. Can we pass some of these on to our friends who are coming in? Thank you so much. And there are also aspects of to the idea of Yom Tov Lippmann, Mulhausen of Krakow, who thought that sculpted works of art in European cathedrals and the words that appear in the Aleinu just prior to the offending sentence, he did not place us like the families of the earth. And he said to this Christian, don't you yourself maintain that the wood and stone figures to which you bow are just likenesses and not themselves divine? In other words, there was a conversation between rabbis and Christians at the time, able to say, hey, we're just doing the same thing. Aleinu is talking about how idols are just idols. There's no God in them. Don't you do the same thing when you have Jesus on the cross? You don't actually believe that that's Jesus on the cross. It is a likeness, right? So don't look at it that way, which is a pretty good argument, I have to say. Oh, friends, but, and this is always sort of an issue, while the literati, while the intelligent and educated might understand this, right? What they say, the rural masses actually sometimes believed that these idols contained gods. They were actually divine objects. The Aleinu then made a lot of sense to show the people that gratitude to God, who did not place us like the families of the earth, that is, the people who work the earth for a living and mistakenly treat works of art like idols. not very nice. Not very nice. I mean, basically, what this rabbi is trying to say is that you did not make us like these stupid people who believe that that things of wood, because they're uneducated. Thank God you didn't make us like that. Not so nice, but you can see why this was full of controversy. Surely enlightened Christians and Jews should agree on this. Besides, he continues that it's undeniable that Verik, the word emptiness, is numerically equivalent to Yeshu, and in fact, Yeshu is not actually Jesus' name. Good point. Christians call him Jesus and Jews call him Yeshua, both of which have different numerical equivalents. In other words, don't worry, it's just it's not the right name. But just as so many times over, eventually, as much as these rabbis could try to convince the Christian authorities or the Muslim authorities that we're not actually talking about you, to avoid incidents with authorities, the line was censored. That is, except for the Sephardi Jews, we don't know why, but they just sort of kept it in there. So if you open up a Sephardic prayer book, it's still in there. So kudos to them, I guess. Now, moving on to the crux of what we're really talking about in terms of modern liturgy. Okay, here at Temple Israel, we have elected to do the top version of the Aleinu, which completely removes that line. He did not make us like the families of the earth. Why do we do that? Because he did not make us like the families of the earth. For the other nations of the world seems to be, and again, we've been through this whole thing of like what it's supposed to mean, and it's not supposed to be about idol worship or pagan or whatever it is, but it sure sounds like, and that's important, perception is important, it sure sounds like, thank God that God didn't make us like those other religions, Christians, Islam, atheists, whatever it is. Now, in the modern America, where we have interfaith couples and interfaith families, and we have a great deal of respect for these other religions, that's not a nice thing to say. And we don't want our friends to think that that is what we are saying. And you cannot, I would say, it's not very easy to convince me, as a rabbi who studied this text, that it isn't insulting. It does sound like a polemic against somebody, and that is not something that we need in our liturgy. We have plenty of wonderful pieces of prayer. We don't need a polemic against anything. I would also add that the Reform movement removed the line in the Nisim B'chol Yom, those morning blessings of God who did not make me. I think the translation is did not make me a goy. Instead says made me a Jew, or instead he made me a Jew, made me Israel, instead of negative, to be positive. So, Jacob Pinikowski, who was an amazing scholar and was a professor at HUC, at seminary, before my time, unfortunately, noted that as a whole, while the Aleinu has kept the balance between this discussion of universalism versus particularism, this is really where it comes down. The form in which the particularism has been expressed has generally been found to be disturbing for the liturgists of liberal and Reformed Judaism. It's true, it seemed to be a language that was a little bit too particularistic. Thank God that God didn't make us like those other people. Sure doesn't sound good. Modern liturgists in countries like Italy found elements of the traditional Aleinu problematic, and in 1672, the Italian prayer book substituted the word laws for families. That was a nice way to do it, right? Who did not, who has not placed judgments on us with other families on the earth. In other words, we don't, the laws that we follow are different. There's a unique commitment to laws that Jews have, to Jewish laws. Everyone else has got their own rules. So that was one way to deal with it. And Moses Mendelssohn, the founder, we could say the founder of modern Orthodoxy, adopted that way about a century later. And I say this is really important because even the traditionalists in the early modern period judged the manifested context of the classical Aleinu as awkward. Right? It is a small wonder that virtually all non-Orthodox liturgies of the last 2 centuries have felt similarly and seem fit to alter it somehow. In other words, the Aleinu has been altered like crazy. Not just Reformed Jews have found problems with it. A lot of people have found that line and those aspects really awkward or problematic. And so changing it or removing lines is just a part of this history of this liturgy, right? In the Hamburg prayer books of 1819 and 1841, as well as David Einhorn's Olat Tamid, they removed the prayer altogether, right? These were the early reformers, right? They just said, forget it. I'm just going to remove it. Geiger, on the other hand, he found this balance. He retained the prayer in his prayer books, but he omitted the line, the one that we've been talking about. He did not make us like the nations of the lands. He did not make us like the families of the earth. Did not make our lot like theirs or our destiny like all of them. Instead, in 1854, he substituted a Hebrew sentence, who was revealed to our fathers and informed them of his will and established his covenant with them and bequeathed them his Torah. Much more, and at the time that they used he, so excuse the gender language, but much more, much less offensive to say, thank God for the things that we do, that we bless for Ahavat Rabbah or Ahavat Olam, gave us the Torah and created our covenant with each other and all those sort of wonderful Jewish things. There's nothing to do with what God didn't make us like. In 1870, his prayer book stated, we who acknowledge God's unity and are called to dedicate ourselves to God's name and God's service, we in particular are obligated to praise the Lord of the universe and proclaim God's greatness in the world's creator. Again, very neutral, very nice. So how did that from Germany come down to America? Well, our buddy Isaac Mayer Wise agreed with Geiger, and he omitted those same offensive statements from the version of Aleinu, but did not offer anything in its place. He rearranged the order of the prayer. Now this, friends, rearranging the order of the prayer is what followed Isaac Mayer Wise's example here. The 20th century Reformed prayer books generally follow these patterns established by Geiger and Wise. So the UPB, the Union Prayer Book, published a vernacular rendition of the universalistic dimensions of the prayer, whereas Gates of Prayer, which is Mishkan Tefillah's predecessor, offered 3 alternative Hebrew versions of this prayer, based upon the models and words supplied by Geiger and Wise. So one of the critiques that I had of Gates of Prayer is it was just too much. They had multiple editions and versions of prayers. To be fair, Mishkan Tefillah does that as well, but it's sort of a much cleaner way. Now, what does Mishkan Tefillah do? If you go back to our first page, and if you look at the bottom version of Aleinu, the bottom version is the one that we would call the traditionalist version, but of course, as we know, no such thing as tradition. We know that it has been changed throughout the century, so the latest traditional version. But on the top part, the one that we say, those lines were retained. These lines come from later in the prayer. If you were to continue in the traditional version of Aleinu, on the bottom version, after Vanach Mekori, Lifnei Melech, Malkei HaMachim, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, immediately you would go into So what the creators of Mishkan Tefillah did was to take those lines and replace the lines that were a little bit awkward or offensive with those later verses. That's exactly what they did, and they followed in the path of Geiger and Wise. So for hundreds of years we've been doing this. And instead of offering 3 alternative prayers like Gates of Prayer, we instituted what was the latest traditional version, and at the top, the one that we reformers would feel more comfortable with, so that no matter what, there would be nothing that would be awkward or offensive in terms of the Aleinu. So, in case you were wondering why we do this different version of the Aleinu, one, we are following in the footsteps of reformers going back to the rabbis of the Talmud, who took a prayer and said there are issues with it. Let's change it. And then we follow how to deal with that through the lines and ideas of the German reformers who brought Reform Judaism to America. And so what we do now, instead of going to the traditional version and going to the Shivna Teshamayim, which as we get to it tonight, we'll see there are pages and pages of the Aleinu. Instead, we do that top version, which holds those aspects, so we wouldn't want to do it again because that would be redundant. And then we go to the very end on 591. Okay? So that was a lot of information, but really, really important. And we have time for some questions. Questions about Aleinu and this change and controversy and all that fun stuff. Yes, Pam.
It was the small prayer book, the old one.
UPB, Minyan Prayer Book.
And I remember saying the Aleinu and remembering those lines. They have a strange familiarity.
Mm-hmm.
And as a child, I thought, well, we're special.
Yeah, that's sort of the wrong message.
Yeah, and it was my very simple way, you know.
And that's exactly what the rabbis are trying to avoid, right? Is we don't, like, it's very natural if you read those messages to say, this is particularistic. This is saying Jews are the chosen people. God didn't make us like other people. And as much as a rabbi can stare at you and say, it's about idol worship and it's about whatever, the average Joe Jew is going to think, hey, I'm special. That is not what we're trying to say in the Aleinu. That's exactly why Minyan Prayer Book, like many of the prayer books before it, dating millennia, had to deal with this awkwardness. And remember, we spoke about that and the fact that the highly educated and the literati who knew, they were like, well, obviously this is this and this and this. But the average Joe reads it and it sure seems like polemic. It sure seems like particularism. So what you felt was exactly what the more, what we would say, liberal rabbis would say, that's not what we want you to feel when we're doing the Aleinu. You're not supposed to feel that Jews are better than anybody else. We're supposed to say, hey, isn't it great that God's so awesome and we're with God and it's this great partnership. That's okay. But I appreciate it. That's like a real world sort of issue. Other questions? Jan?
Well, like elderly people that don't know Jews, but they're like, oh, you're the chosen people. I'm like, no.
Yeah, don't say that.
We chose to do God's work at the time or something. I mean, I just don't go around, but I'm like, no. Because they really like it. Oh, I'm like, no, we're not part of that.
So there is a.
What's the standard response to this?
I don't know. There is a line that we Jews have to toe between the understanding that of all the nations, God chose to give us the Torah, and that we are, beloved by God, and God showed love to us by giving us the Torah, without crossing over that line and saying, aren't we special and you're not? Because when we cross that line, or rather, when someone believes that we cross that line, a great deal of anti-Semitism is built, ideas of arrogance and elitism and all those sort of horrible things. So we try especially hard to make sure that when someone says, oh, you're the chosen people, that's very nice of you to say, but the truth is, our belief system says this, but your belief system says that. To be fair, Christianity says we're the new covenant, we're the chosen people, so which they're welcome to believe. And Islam says the same thing. Muhammad revealed this to us, we're the chosen people. So it's just the same sort of, Abrahamic faith that we've got. But again, what I would say is that, and I think that my predecessors, and people who are far more experienced than I would say, is that even the illusion of that is something that we don't need in our prayers. I mean, you can discuss that later, but we certainly don't need it in our prayers. We don't need to be, giving polemics and other people are being confused or thinking that we're so special in our prayers. That's something we don't have to do. So, any last questions? Yeah.
Are there any other prayers that have the same problem that have to be?
Yes, the Desim B'chol Yom, the daily prayers. There was the one. There's a couple ones that were removed. One was Baruch Atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, who did not make me a woman. We removed that one. You're welcome. Because that's just but the other one was that we changed actually. It did say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who did not make me a goyim, a non-Jew, basically. And instead, we say the positive, who made us, She'asani Yisrael, who made us Israel. And so again, it's just those little changes so that we can say, we're affirming how proud we are and how wonderful it is that we're Jews without stepping on anybody else's toes. For lots of good reasons. One, because it's not nice, but two, because it invites polemic and invites groans and anti-Semitism. So friends, it is 7:32, which means Shabbat services are starting. So give me 2 minutes to set up, take a few minutes, say hello, Shabbat Shalom to everybody, and we will get going. Thank you so much.